The morning began like any other in Duncanville, a mid-sized city where the oldest diner in town had poured coffee and, more often, sweet tea for 3 generations of families. Nobody watching the quiet street that day could have guessed that within 1 hour, a single officer's arrogance would unravel a web of corruption that had been rotting quietly inside the police department for years. A black couple sat in a corner booth, dressed plainly, speaking softly, minding their own business. An officer walked in with his chest puffed out, looking for someone smaller than himself to humiliate. Dozens of customers watched the scene unfold, and almost none of them said a word. What that officer never understood was that the 2 people he chose to target were not ordinary citizens at all. They were undercover detectives, deep inside an investigation that could end his career, his sergeant's career, and expose a truth the entire department had been burying for a very long time. Late winter had settled over Duncanville with a pale, silvery light, the kind that made even tired eyes feel a little more forgiving. Andre Bellamy and his wife, Simone, had just finished a 26-hour surveillance stretch, the kind that drained the body but never touched the mind, because both of them had trained for decades to stay sharp, no matter how long the shift ran. They pulled into the gravel lot of the Copper Spoon Cafe in a weathered brown pickup truck with a cracked side mirror, the kind of vehicle nobody looks at twice. Andre wore a deep burgundy sweater under a navy peacoat, and Simone had on an olive green wrap sweater, her braids pinned back loosely. Nothing about either of them suggested anything but 2 ordinary people looking for breakfast after a long night. Inside, the cafe smelled like buttermilk batter and warm syrup, the hum of quiet conversation filling the room. They chose a booth near the window, the same one they always chose, because from that seat, Andre could see the entire room and the street outside without turning his head. Simone slid in across from him and reached for the menu, though she already knew what she wanted, because ordering the same thing every time was one more habit that made them forgettable. A young server took their order with a tired smile, 2 glasses of sweet tea, a plate of buttermilk waffles to split, sausage on the side. Nothing unusual about any of it. They talked quietly while they waited, the kind of conversation only 2 people who trust each other completely can have. Simone teased him about the way he always drowned his waffles in syrup and then complained they were too sweet. Andre laughed, admitting she was right, admitting it every single week for the past 16 years. There was an ease between them that came from more than marriage. It came from years of watching each other's backs in rooms, far more dangerous than a diner booth. Neither of them spoke about work. They never did in public. Not even here. Not even after a shift that had lasted well over a full day. Simone reached across the table and took his hand for a moment, her thumb brushing over his knuckles, a small gesture that said more than words ever could. Andre looked at her the way he always did, like she was still the same woman he'd fallen for at the academy so many years ago. Back when neither of them had any idea how far they'd eventually go together, the server returned with their plates, and for a few minutes, there was nothing but the comfortable silence of 2 people enjoying a meal after a hard night. Simone mentioned, almost offhandedly, that this diner reminded her of a small place back in her hometown, one her aunt used to take her to every Saturday morning. Back when life felt slower, Andre listened the way he always did, fully present, never rushing her, letting the memory unfold at its own pace. He told her, in return, about the first apartment they'd shared, a cramped little unit above a laundromat, where the pipes rattled every time someone ran the washer upstairs, and how neither of them had cared one bit because they were finally together after years stationed in different cities. They laughed softly at the memory, the kind of laughter that only exists between 2 people who've built an entire life out of small, ordinary moments like this one. For a few minutes, they were not detectives, not partners assigned to a dangerous case, just a husband and wife enjoying breakfast on a quiet winter morning, exactly the way any other couple in that diner might have been doing. Outside, Sunlight caught the chrome grille of a patrol car pulling into the lot, tires crunching slowly over the gravel. Neither Andre nor Simone reacted, because squad cars stopping at diners were nothing unusual in a city like this one. What neither of them expected was the way that particular morning was about to change everything, not just for themselves, but for an entire department built on secrets. The door swung open with more force than necessary, and Officer Derek Voss stepped inside like he owned the building and everyone standing in it. He was 29 years old, built like someone who spent more time at the gym than on actual patrol. His uniform pressed sharp, his sunglasses pushed up on his head, even though the cafe was dim. The first thing he did was bark at the young host to move a family out of a booth so he could sit closer to the window, and the host scrambled to obey without a word of protest. Derek had a way of walking through a room that made people shrink a little, not because he'd done anything to them personally, but because his presence carried the weight of a badge he clearly believed made him untouchable. His eyes swept across the cafe slowly, scanning faces the way a predator scans a herd, looking for the one that seemed weakest. When his gaze landed on Andre and Simone sitting quietly in their corner booth, something in his expression shifted, something small and ugly that most people in the room didn't even notice. He'd grown up in this city, the son of an auto body technician and a dental hygienist, and somewhere along the way, wearing the uniform had convinced him that respect was owed to him automatically rather than earned through decency. Colleagues at the station often described him as hungry, though few ever used the word with any real warmth behind it. He'd been passed over for a promotion twice in the last 5 years, a fact that gnawed at him more than he ever admitted aloud, and lately he'd taken to asserting his authority in small, petty ways whenever the opportunity presented itself. This particular morning, tired and irritable after a rough overnight shift of his own, he was looking for exactly that kind of opportunity, and the quiet couple in the corner booth seemed, to his narrow way of thinking, like an easy target. He noted the peacoat, he noted the wrap sweater with a loose thread near the sleeve, he noted the old pickup parked outside that didn't match. In his mind, the kind of vehicle regular customers of this cafe usually drove, none of it meant anything, and none of it was his business. But Derek had built an entire career on deciding who belonged, where based on nothing more than a glance. He walked over slowly, thumbs hooked into his belt, his boots heavy against the tile, every step deliberate and loud enough to draw attention. "I don't recognize you two," he said, stopping beside their table, his voice pitched just loud enough for nearby booths to hear. Simone looked up first. "Calm, Polita," the same expression she might give a stranger asking for directions. "We're just having breakfast." "Officer," she said simply, no edge in her voice at all. Andre said nothing yet, choosing instead to study the man in front of him the way he studied every subject in every interview room he'd ever worked. Patient, quiet, absorbing every detail. Derek asked for identification, though he had no legal reason to. Simone, still calm, asked what exactly they had done wrong. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he repeated himself, louder this time, insisting he needed to see identification because, in his words, people like you don't usually eat here. A few nearby customers glanced up from their plates, uneasy, sensing the shift in the air, but unwilling to get involved. Andre finally spoke, his voice low, even almost gentle. "We haven't broken any laws, and we'd like to finish our breakfast." Derek's jaw tightened at the calm in Andre's voice, as if the absence of fear offended him personally. "I didn't ask for your opinion," Derek said, leaning down slightly, his hand resting on the edge of the table now, close enough that Simone could smell the stale energy drink on his breath. "I asked for identification, and I'm not going to ask a third time." Simone tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. and asked quite reasonably whether he had any actual cause to demand it from two people simply eating breakfast. Derek straightened, clearly irritated that neither of them had shown the fear he expected, his eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the small crowd, now watching from nearby booths. "Cause is, whatever I decide it is," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear a statement that drew a visible wince from an elderly man seated 2 tables away. "Stand up," Derek said, his tone hardening into something closer to a command than a request. "Both of you, get up and leave." The cafe had gone quieter now, forks pausing mid-air, a few phones lifting slightly from tables as people began to sense that something worth watching was about to happen. Derek's patience, thin from the start, evaporated within seconds, his voice climbing another notch, echoing off the tiled walls. He reached out and gripped Andre's shoulder, not gently, pressing down as though trying to force him upward out of the booth by sheer will alone. "I said get up," he snapped, "before I make this a lot worse for both of you." Andre did not flinch, did not raise his voice, simply looked down at the hand on his shoulder, then back up at Derek, with an expression that unsettled the officer more than any shout could have. Around the room, a few customers had begun quietly filming with their phones, the way people do now when they sense injustice happening but feel too afraid to physically intervene. An older man near the counter muttered something about finally someone doing their job, while a young mother, 2 booths down, looked horrified, pulling her own phone from her purse with trembling hands. Most of the cafe simply sat in silence, eyes darting between their plates and the unfolding scene. Nobody quite brave enough to stand and speak. "You two don't look like you can even afford what's on this table," Derek said, his voice dripping with a cruelty that made even his own partner outside visibly uncomfortable through the window. "Maybe that's the real problem here. Maybe you're here to cause trouble. Or maybe you just can't pay. Either way, I'm not interested in finding out the hard way." Simone's expression did not change, though her eyes had sharpened, taking in every word, every gesture, filing it away with the precision of someone who'd spent years learning to read exactly this kind of man. Louise Ferris, the cafe's owner for nearly 3 decades, came rushing out from behind the counter, her apron still dusted with flour, her voice pleading for calm. "Officer, please, these are paying customers. There's no need for this," she said, stepping close enough to place herself almost between Derek and the booth. Derek waved her off without even looking at her, telling her to get back behind the counter and let him handle his job. Louise Voss fell, caught between fear of the officer and shame for the couple she'd just watched be treated so unfairly. It was at that moment that Sergeant Frank Doran walked through the door, drawn by the commotion visible through the cafe's front window. Frank was 51, broad-shouldered, with the kind of grey at his temples that made people assume wisdom where there was often only stubbornness. Rather than calming the situation, as Louise had hoped, Frank immediately sided with his junior officer, placing a firm hand on Derek's shoulder in solidarity rather than restraint. "What's the trouble here?" Frank asked, though his tone made clear he'd already decided whose side he was on before hearing a single detail. Derek explained, twisting the story slightly, painting Andre and Simone as suspicious, uncooperative, possibly dangerous, though nothing about their behavior had suggested any of that at all. Frank nodded along, glancing at the couple with open suspicion, the kind of look that assumed guilt before a single fact had been established. The tension in the cafe thickened, customers now openly staring, phones raised a little higher, the sound of Frank's radio crackling faintly at his hip. Simone remained still, her hands folded calmly on the table, watching both officers with the patience of someone who had faced far worse men in far more dangerous rooms. Andre finally spoke again, his voice steady, almost too calm for the situation. cutting through the noise like a blade through paper. "Is this your final decision?" he asked, looking directly at Frank, not a trace of fear in his voice. The question hung in the air, simple and sharp, and something about the way he asked it made even Frank hesitate for half a second before answering. Binau. Nearly every customer in the cafe had shifted their attention entirely toward the corner booth. Sensing that something about this moment did not fit the ordinary shape of a diner disturbance, Simone's gaze flicked briefly toward Andre. A small, almost invisible signal passed between them. The kind of silent communication only years of partnership could build. Andre's eyes, meanwhile, moved with quiet efficiency. First to the patrol car parked outside, memorizing its plate number without seeming to look directly at it. He noted the name stitched onto Derek's uniform. Then Frank's, filing both away with the same effortless precision he might use cataloging evidence at a crime scene. He glanced toward the small security camera mounted above the counter, confirming it was active. Its red light blinking steadily. None of this behavior matched that of an ordinary, frightened citizen being harassed by police. An ordinary person, faced with two armed officers demanding they leave, might tremble, might raise their voice, might beg or argue or cry. Andre and Simone did none of these things. Instead, they observed, catalogued, and waited, their stillness unnerving, in a way neither Derek nor Frank seemed capable of understanding. Derek, misreading their calm entirely, assumed it was fear, disguised as defiance, the kind of frozen silence he'd seen plenty of times, from people too intimidated to fight back. Emboldened by what he believed was total control of the situation, he pressed harder, stepping closer, his hand drifting toward the radio at his belt. "You've got until the count of 3, he said, loud enough now that the entire cafe had fallen into a tense, uneasy silence. It was then that Andre reached slowly into the inner pocket of his coat, his movement deliberate, unhurried, careful enough that even Derek's hand paused halfway toward his holster. Several customers gasped audibly, certain they were about to witness something far worse than a shouting match. What Andre pulled out, however, was nothing more than a plain black cell phone, its screen dark, its surface unremarkable in every way. Nearly everyone in the cafe assumed the same thing at once, that he was reaching for a lawyer, or a family member, someone who might rescue him from this humiliation, with a phone call full of desperate pleading. They were wrong. Andre pressed a single button on the side of the phone, a sequence so quick and practiced it barely registered as unusual. He raised the device briefly to his ear and, in a voice utterly devoid of panic, spoke 6 words that meant absolutely nothing to anyone in that cafe except the person on the other end of the line. "Operation Ashwood. Status compromised," he said, calm as if reporting the weather, and then lowered the phone without waiting for a reply. Derek blinked, momentarily thrown by the strange, clipped phrase, though he quickly dismissed it as some kind of bluff. Simone, without a word, reached into her sweater pocket and typed a short sequence into her own phone, her fingers moving with practiced speed. In reality, it was an authentication code, one that would activate a chain of communication reaching far beyond the walls of this small cafe. Neither of them stood. Neither attempted to leave. They simply sat back in the booth, hands folded, waiting with the eerie patience of people who already knew exactly what was coming next. Derek, furious at what he perceived as continued defiance, unclipped a pair of handcuffs from his belt, the metallic click drawing gasps from several onlookers. "That's it," he snapped, stepping around the table toward Andre. "You're both under arrest for obstruction." Frank, still standing nearby, nodded in approval. apparently ready to back whatever charge his junior officer decided to invent on the spot. Louise covered her mouth with both hands, tears welling in her eyes, certain she was about to watch two innocent people dragged out in cuffs over nothing but a bad breakfast and worse judgment. At that exact moment, through the cafe's front window, several unmarked sedans rolled quietly into the parking lot, moving with a coordination no ordinary traffic could explain. Customers near the window turned first, drawn by the sudden convergence of vehicles arriving almost simultaneously, doors opening in near-perfect unison. Derek, cuffs still dangling from one hand, paused, mid-step, his confidence flickering for the first time since he'd entered the building. The cafe's front door swung open once more, and this time it was not another customer walking in. A woman stepped through first, moving with the calm, deliberate authority of someone who commanded rooms for a living, her badge already visible on her hip. Behind her, 5 more figures entered in plain clothes, their postures unmistakably trained, their presence instantly transforming the atmosphere of the cafe from confusion into something closer to reverence. Captain Renata Cruz walked directly past both Derek and Frank, without acknowledging either of them, her focus entirely fixed on the booth in the corner. She stopped in front of Andre, straightened her shoulders, and said a single word that stunned nearly everyone listening. "Sir," she said, her voice crisp, respectful, unmistakably deferential toward the very man Derek had just tried to drag out in handcuffs. The cafe fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter suddenly seemed deafening. Simone reached into her sweater once more, producing a small leather badge wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming detective shield beneath the fabric. Andre followed, retrieving a folded document from his coat, an official assignment certificate bearing seals that Derek recognized instantly. Seals belonging to the very department he served under. Renata turned to address the stunned cafe, her voice carrying easily across the silent room. "These two individuals," she said, gesturing toward the booth, "are Detective Andre Bellamy and Detective Simone Bellamy, currently assigned to an internal affairs and organized crime task force." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd, whispers breaking out, despite the tension still thick in the air. Renata continued, explaining that the couple had spent the past several months embedded in an undercover operation, targeting corruption within this very city's police department. An operation that had, until this exact morning, remained completely confidential. Derek's face drained of all color, the handcuffs slipping from his fingers and clattering uselessly against the tile floor. Frank, standing frozen beside his junior officer, opened his mouth as if to explain himself, though no words managed to escape. Renata's gaze shifted toward him, cold and unblinking, the kind of look that needed no accompanying threat to communicate exactly how much trouble he now faced. Louise, still standing near the counter with tears streaking her cheeks, pressed a trembling hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the impossible turn the morning had taken. Whispers rippled through the cafe as customers turned to one another in disbelief, several lowering their phones now that the scene had shifted from shocking cruelty to something closer to stunned wonder. Renata allowed the silence to stretch a long moment before speaking again, letting the weight of the revelations settle over the room. She explained, calmly and without theatrics, that everything which had just occurred inside this cafe had already been recorded not only by customers' phones, but by multiple additional sources neither Derek nor Frank had been aware of. The cafe's internal security camera, she noted, had captured the entire confrontation from start to finish, its footage already secured. Beyond that, several of the plainclothes officers who'd just entered had been stationed nearby for the past hour, their own body cameras running continuously since before Derek had ever stepped through the door. Derek's mouth opened and closed several times, no coherent sound emerging. His earlier confidence completely dissolved. Andre finally rose from the booth, unhurried, brushing a small crumb from his sleeve before speaking directly to the sergeant, standing frozen beside his subordinate. "This wasn't the first time," Andre said quietly, his tone free of anger, free of triumph. Simply stating a fact, he revealed that Officer Voss's name had appeared repeatedly throughout the ongoing investigation, tied to at least 4 prior incidents involving excessive force, unlawful searches, and repeated interference with cases that should never have been obstructed. Frank's face went pale as Andre continued, explaining that 2 of those obstructed cases had, in fact, been directly connected to the very corruption network he and Simone had spent months infiltrating. What today's incident revealed, Andre explained, was not an isolated lapse in judgment, but the final, unnecessary mistake in a long pattern of behavior that had already been under close scrutiny. Renata added that the investigation into Derek's conduct would now expand immediately, incorporating today's events as fresh, undeniable evidence gathered in full view of dozens of witnesses. One of the plainclothes detectives who'd entered alongside her stepped forward, holding a slim folder prepared well in advance of this very moment. Inside, Renata explained, were sworn statements from 3 separate citizens who had filed complaints against Derek over the past 3 years, each one previously closed without any real investigation. Each one now reopened, as of this morning. She noted, calmly but firmly, that Sergeant Doran's signature appeared on every single one of those closed files. A detail that made Frank's already pale face turn nearly grey. Within hours, the quiet corruption investigation that had remained hidden for months exploded into something far larger than anyone inside that cafe could have anticipated. Renata's team, working alongside city officials, obtained warrants to search the records room at the Central Police Station, along with several computers belonging to officers named throughout the case files. What they uncovered painted a picture far darker than even Andre and Simone had initially suspected. Investigators found altered incident reports, dates and details quietly changed to protect officers accused of misconduct, some stretching back nearly 6 years. Digital forensics teams recovered deleted evidence files, including body camera footage that had been wiped from department servers following a dozen separate citizen complaints over the years. Several bank accounts, traced carefully by financial investigators working alongside Andre's team, revealed unexplained deposits totaling well over $340,000 across multiple officers, funds that seemed to originate from a private security contractor with no legitimate connection to the department. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable: a small but powerful group within the department, protecting one another while quietly profiting from the very corruption they were sworn to prevent. Investigators also discovered a small notebook hidden inside Frank's desk drawer, filled with handwritten notes detailing which officers had been warned in advance about surprise inspections, and which citizen complaints had been quietly buried before ever reaching a supervisor's desk. One entry, dated nearly 5 months earlier, referenced a payment of $42,000 connected to a case involving a warehouse raid that had mysteriously turned up empty despite reliable informant tips beforehand. Andre recognized the case immediately, having reviewed it himself during the earliest weeks of the undercover operation, never once suspecting it would eventually trace back so directly to the sergeant standing before him now. Piece by piece, the investigation revealed a system that had rotted quietly from the inside for years. Hidden behind a badge the community had once trusted without question, news of the search spread quickly through Duncanville. And by midday, Mayor Bennett Hale had arrived personally at the police station, his expression a mixture of shock and barely contained fury. Bennett, 58 years old and known throughout the city for his careful, measured public persona, stood before a small crowd of reporters that had gathered outside the station and announced, his voice tight with controlled anger. That an independent oversight committee would be formed immediately, separate entirely from the department's own internal structure, to review every finding uncovered during the investigation. Word of the cafe incident, combined with news of the search, spread through the city with startling speed, moving from neighbor to neighbor, from shop to shop, until nearly everyone in Duncanville had heard some version of the story by nightfall. The days that followed brought a wave of public attention few in Duncanville had ever witnessed before. The quiet incident inside the Copper Spoon Cafe having grown into something the entire city could not stop discussing. A formal press conference was held outside City Hall steps. Mayor Bennett Hale standing beside Captain Renata Cruz, as both addressed a crowd far larger than anyone had expected for a city this size. Bennett spoke first, acknowledging publicly that the department had failed the community in ways that demanded immediate and lasting reform. He praised the courage and professionalism of detectives Andre and Simone Bellamy, careful to note that their composure under such humiliating treatment had ultimately protected the integrity of an investigation that would now hold multiple officers accountable. Renata followed, outlining the scope of the corruption uncovered, promising transparency throughout the disciplinary process, and confirming that additional officers beyond Derek and Frank were now under active review. In the days after the press conference, Louise Ferris found herself approached repeatedly by customers, offering quiet apologies, some for their own silence that morning. Others simply overwhelmed by shame at having witnessed injustice without acting. She accepted each apology gently, though she made clear more than once that the true courage that day had belonged entirely to the couple who had sat calmly through humiliation without ever losing their composure. Several former victims of Officer Voss's past misconduct, encouraged by the sudden public attention, came forward for the first time, filing formal complaints that added even more weight to the growing case against him. One young man, a delivery driver named Julian Ashcroft, described being pulled over 3 times in 6 weeks for what he was told were routine checks. Though each time he was released without so much as a warning, once Derek realized there was nothing to find. A woman named Priya Nolan, who ran a small flower shop downtown, recalled an afternoon nearly 3 years earlier when Derek had accused her teenage nephew of shoplifting without any evidence at all, an accusation that had never gone anywhere, but had left the boy shaken for months afterward. Each new account added another thread to a pattern that oversight investigators now had no choice but to take seriously. The weight of dozens of small, previously ignored, injustices finally converging into something impossible to dismiss. Officer Derek Voss was formally suspended without pay within 48 hours of the incident. His badge and service weapons surrendered under the watchful eyes of 2 senior officials from the newly formed Oversight Committee. Sergeant Frank Doran, though not immediately suspended, was placed under formal investigation, his years of quiet protection for junior officers finally catching up with him in ways he'd clearly never anticipated. Throughout it all, Andre and Simone remained remarkably private, declining nearly every request for interviews, choosing instead to let the evidence and the process speak entirely for itself. Their quiet dignity, so different from the loud outrage swirling around the city, only seemed to deepen the public's growing respect for them. A local business owner organized a small gathering outside City Hall, not a protest exactly, but a quiet vigil of sorts. Residents holding handwritten signs, thanking the 2 detectives for their courage, without ever naming them directly, respecting the privacy they had so clearly asked for. A retired police captain, long since removed from active duty, wrote a letter to the local newspaper praising the couple's restraint, noting that true strength rarely needed to raise its voice to be heard. A full week passed before Duncanville began to feel something close to normal again, the initial shockwaves of the scandal settling into a steadier rhythm of accountability and reform. On a cool, quiet morning, much like the one that had started it all, Andre and Simone returned to the Copper Spoon Cafe. choosing once again the same corner booth beside the window. Louise spotted them the moment they walked through the door and crossed the room quickly, wrapping Simone in a warm, grateful embrace before either of them could even sit down. The atmosphere inside the cafe felt entirely different this time, free of the weary glances and uneasy silence that had filled the room just 1 week earlier. Regular customers nodded respectfully as the couple settled into their booth, a few offering quiet words of thanks, though none lingered long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Andre ordered his usual sweet tea and waffles, and Simone smiled at the familiarity of it all, grateful that some things, at least, had remained exactly the same. As they waited for their food, Andre looked out the window at the quiet street beyond, watching the city move slowly through its morning routine, unaware of how close it had come to losing faith entirely in the people meant to protect it. The most dangerous thing, he said quietly, more to himself than to Simone, though she was listening closely as always, isn't power itself. It's power that believes no one will ever be brave enough to question it. Simone reached across the table, resting her hand gently over his, her expression soft but certain. And justice, she said, always begins the moment someone finally decides to stand up. Andre nodded slowly, turning his attention back to his tea, allowing himself, for the first time in months, a genuine and unguarded smile. Around them, the cafe buzzed with ordinary conversation, the comforting clatter of plates and cups, the simple rhythm of a city slowly healing itself one quiet morning at a time. Louise stopped by their booth once more before the morning rush picked up, setting down a small plate of pastries neither of them had ordered, insisting quietly that it was on the house for as long as they kept coming back. Simone thanked her warmly, and for a moment the two women simply looked at each other, an understanding passing between them that needed no further words. Andre glanced toward the front window, watching a school bus roll slowly past, children's laughter faintly audible, even through the glass, a small reminder of the ordinary life this city was slowly reclaiming for itself. He thought briefly of all the mornings just like this one that might have gone differently for other people in other towns, people who never got the chance to be believed, and the thought settled heavily in his chest before passing just as quickly. Simone noticed the shift in his expression, the way it always seemed to happen when his mind wandered toward the weight of the job rather than the comfort of the moment. She squeezed his hand gently under the table, drawing his attention back to her, back to the warmth of the cafe, back to the simple fact that today, at least, something had gone right. We did our job, she said softly, and for once, doing our job actually meant someone got to keep theirs, and someone else finally lost one they never deserved. Andre managed a quiet laugh at that, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, grateful as always for her ability to find clarity in moments that could easily become heavy. Outside, the pale winter light spilled gently across Duncanville's streets, warming a city that had learned, in the most unexpected way, that true justice rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives quietly, patiently, carried by people willing to sit still and wait for the truth to finally reveal itself. The camera of memory pulls back slowly from the corner booth, past the window, past the gravel lot, where an old brown pickup sits parked beside a scattering of ordinary cars, out onto the street where the city continues its quiet morning rhythm, unaware of how close it had come to losing something far more valuable than a single breakfast. Duncanville moves forward now, a little wiser, a little more watchful, carrying with it the simple lesson that dignity, patience, and truth will always outlast arrogance in the end.